All right, chapter 3. So let's really get into this part. This is the meat of the chapter, the demographic transition. So let's look at this right here. Let me zoom in. And let's start with this. It's got 5 phases. So let's start with this. In phase 1, so this would be a country, let's go back to the United States in 1776, right? The birth rate. The birth rate is how many children were born for every person alive. So if you had a population of 100, there were 40 births per year. For every 100 people, there were 40 births, right? That's a very high birth rate, by the way. But for every 1,000, let's do this for every, let me go back to that. Let's say by 1,000. For every 1,000 people, there were 40 new people born every year. But at the same time, for every 1,000 people, there were 40 deaths every year. So you have a high birth rate, but a high death rate. So what happens is your population doesn't really increase or decrease. It stays about the same. If you have 40 people born per thousand and 40 people dying per thousand, population doesn't stays the same. But something happens in stage 2. Something happens where the death rate begins to fall and fall rapidly. This could be something as simple as public or sewers. We know that sewage, like human refuge, human waste, when it gets into wells and drinking water, can make people sick, like cholera. So if you go to a city that has all this pollution, people dump out their stuff in the streets, which is what happened through most of it, and you put in public sewers, clean drinking water, a very quick fix. Vaccines, giving children vaccines so that they don't die of the measles, of whooping cough, of diphtheria. Very quick and easy fixes, easy medicine, and the death rate begins to fall. So here, maybe we'll say in the year 1850, we start seeing sewers, we start seeing better health. By the 1890s now, the birth rate is still 40 per 1,000, but now the death rate is only 20 or 25. And so if you have more people being born than dying, your population begins to increase. And the population of the United States in the 1850s does dramatically begin to increase. So stage 2, very rapid increase. Stage 3, the death rate continues to fall, but now it's not falling as fast. It's still getting better, but not as good. So that's one aspect. But at the same time, in stage 3, now the birth rate begins to fall. You start seeing smaller families. So it goes from 40 people per 1,000 to about maybe 20 people. And so what happens is the death rate falls, the birth rate begins to fall. So the increase in population still happens, but begins to shrink. And you can see over here the population here really takes off here, but now it's beginning to kind of flatten out. Stage 4, birth rate and death rate are now low. And so population begins to level off. And most countries like us, the United States, are in this level. Stage 5, which is behind my pretty little face, is right here. The birth rate stays very low. The death rate stays low. And now you have a situation in stage 5, which is the opposite of stage 1. Low death rate, low birth rate, and the population begins to shrink. This would be a country like Japan. Japan's actually been losing people since the 1980s. Their population has been shrinking. So the first phase, right? We talked about that. A good example might be here, and also in the second phase, countries like Guatemala, countries that are growing. Their economies are becoming more modern, but they still have a lot of development to go. A lot more access to health. And in these societies where you still see a high birth rate, you see a lot of gender inequality. And that is because in a society like this, right, where women are still having a lot of children, it really prevents them from having a more active role in the economy. Not only for the very act of having children, but also how society views their roles. So in these societies, these countries, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, we see this happening. There's a lot of gender inequality. Once we move into the third phase, we start seeing family planning. Family planning is a controversial term. All it really means is that there is this conscious shift to having less children. It isn't that women all of a sudden do not have the ability to have 10 children, but for various reasons they don't. So many students in this class who are female are probably not having children at this point because it's very hard to go to school and have a child. And maybe not just, I shouldn't just limit that to women, right? That's a conscious choice. That is family planning, right? Other reasons, why don't people have children? Well, if you live in the city, it's very expensive, isn't it, to have children? You've got to pay for daycare, and you have more food and more housing. So these are all issues that basically lower the birth rate. And when that happens, that's when population begins to slow. Some of the countries in South and Central America have this kind of mix where you have parts of the country in the third phase, but some parts still in the first phase. Guatemala and Honduras, Peru, Bolivia have large indigenous populations that are still Native American, and they tend to be living in the countryside. They tend to be much more poorer, less education, less access to the growing economy, and so that part of the population is still in the first phase, whereas those that live in the city have more education, more money, are in the third phase. The fourth phase, and this is kind of where a lot of countries like the United States or Germany or France are stable. The population has kind of evened out. Low birth rate and low death rate. So the population stays roughly the same. Our population is increasing, but not increasing as fast as other countries. A lot of the world is here. Okay? And then the fifth phase, this is a very few countries. Although we envision this to be the future of countries like the United States, the death rate stays low, but the birth rate drops even more. So population is stable or shrinks. And we see this in wealthier countries. A great example is Japan. In Japan, the birth rate has dropped so dramatically that there are concerns that they will have enough people in the future to take care of the people of today. Right? If you're a senior citizen, you need sometimes many people to help you out, people to care for you, doctors, nurses. But if there's not enough people to do that, that's an issue. In a country like Japan, right, people go to school for an education. They go to grade school, they go to high school, they go to college, they maybe go to graduate school. People are spending a lot of time and investing on themselves, their knowledge, and that just like we happen here. You go to school, and what happens is, as you do that, you put off having children usually, because you're investing not so much in children as you are in education. And so by the time people are done with school, they're much older. They maybe don't want to make that transition. And so there are a lot of women in Japan who have gone to school, now are in the workforce, in their late 20s, early 30s, but have decided against having children because to do so, especially in Japan where it's viewed the woman's job to be the mother, to give up all of that which they have worked for doesn't have the appeal. And women are marrying later, if at all. Many people are getting married and not having children. And that's what's happening is you're seeing a huge, huge shrink. Okay? Children are expensive. And one of the things that also happens is in these wealthier countries, because there are so few children, right? You're allowed to, it gives that society the ability to spend more money per child. If you have a neighborhood where you have 100 children, you need to provide a school for them versus a neighborhood of 10 children. So you have the same amount of people but less children, you can spend more per children on that. And so in these countries, we see a significant economic investment in the children. So what happens is these 5 steps transform population. In the 1960s and 70s, there was this concern that the population of the Earth was growing so rapidly that we would basically grow to the point we'd basically too many people and we would collapse. But the demographic transition explains that we've actually noticed that the rate of population growth of the Earth as a whole has increased, but is now beginning to slow. And that, we think, in large part, is the demographic transition. Around the world, generally speaking, people are living longer lives, and populations are getting older. They call it the graying of the population. The average age of a Japanese citizen is in its 50s. Okay? Now, there are some definite cultural after effects of this. And one of the things is, as we've talked about, that gender roles that were usually tied to the idea of fertility and whose role it was to be the mother and the father, or to stay home or to work, those things are changing, for good and for bad. We also see this idea of intergenerationality conflicts. As a population gets older, for instance, it used to be that people would retire in their 60s, and then those jobs would open up, so for people in their 20s and 30s could take them. But one of the issues we've having is people are working longer. And so that basically ties up these spots. There's conflicts for spots that haven't been there before. Another interesting aspect is what we call the demographic dividend, right? If you have a population where you have an increasing number of young people, roughly people who are over 20, right? You have this bulge. In Japan, in 1945, for everybody who was over the age of 65, there were 41 people who were under the age of 65 who could work. In other words, for every retired worker, there were 41 other workers. And why is this important? Well, think about Social Security in this country. For every time you work, or every hour you make money, you give a set percentage, about 8% of that is taxed and goes to Social Security. And that you are working now to support the retirees. Well, what happens in the future when it's your turn? The people that are younger are working are going to support you. But as the demographic transition happened, the number of people available for workers has dropped because people are living longer. And so now, today, in 2020 in Japan, for every retiree, there are only 2.5 people working, which makes those resources much more difficult. So this happens between ages 3 and 4, where you start having more people working than those who are not. And they call it dependent populations. A dependent population is those who are under the age of 18, so children, and those over the age of 65. They depend on people who are between 18 and 65 to support them, right? And this is just showing you the dependency ratio. So as a country moves through the demographic transition, they go from having a very high dependency ratio, or a lot of workers for retirees, to fewer, okay? And so what happens is, as this ratio decreases, right, you have fewer people supporting those who can't support themselves. And that leads to increased competition for resources. I'm going to pause right here, and we're going to explore population pyramids next.